Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to wait just a few minutes to allow folks to come on in. Thank you all again. As you're coming in, get comfortable. We're just going to wait a few minutes to allow folks to arrive and then we'll get started. You're just stepping in. We're going to wait about 2 more minutes just to allow people time to arrive. Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you guys for coming in. We're going to do 1 more minute and then we'll get started. All right, I think we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Swarns. I'm a journalism professor here at NYU, and I am so happy to welcome you to this critical conversation, Affirmative Action's Backstory, Government Set-Asides for White Americans. This conversation is part of a new lecture series and research project that I'm launching here. It's called Hidden Legacies, Slavery, Race, and the Making of 21st Century America. And my goal is really to bring journalists, historians, and students together to produce and promote work that is deeply rooted in history and work that illuminates the experiences of people of color in the United States. So I hope that you will keep coming back for our ongoing series of conversations. And we're having this discussion tonight, a very timely discussion, as you might know, as we await what is likely to be a historic Supreme Court decision on affirmative action this spring. If you follow these issues, you know that the court is expected to deem affirmative action unconstitutional in university admissions. And folks who are hoping for an end to affirmative action would argue that such a decision would bring us back to a place where everyone is on the same playing field, back to an America where no group is advantaged over another. And maybe you've heard those kinds of arguments. We're going to complicate those kinds of arguments for you tonight. We're going to be looking back at that playing field that people like to talk about, looking back at American history. And when you do that, what you see is a long history of government set-asides, not for Black people, not for people of color, but for white Americans. And we have got a great panel, the perfect panel for this conversation. Two award-winning audio journalists who examine this history for Seeing White, a powerful podcast that explored the history of whiteness in America. So here are some introductions, and I'm going to be brief, but you need to read more about these guys because they are amazing. John Biewen is the audio director at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University, where he produces and hosts the award-winning podcast Seen on Radio. He explored the history of white supremacy in Seeing White and the history of American democracy in The Land That Never Has Been Yet. Welcome, John.
It's great to be here, Rachel. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. Dr. Tenderized is a scholar, producer, and advocate who works with me now. And all of you who are NYU folks, we are so lucky to have him. He specializes in using narrative nonfiction audio journalism to critique the ideology of American historical myths about issues such as race, the Civil War, and policing. And these guys know each other. They work together on Seen on Radio's Seeing White and the series on, the podcast on American democracy. And Chenjerai is also the co-creator and co-executive producer and co-host of Uncivil, Gimlet Media's podcast on the Civil War, which is really awesome too. So thank you, Chenjerai.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, ready for the conversation.
Great. So, and for all of you who are joining us, this is how it's going to go. We're going to have a conversation here, me with Chenjerai and John. And as we go, if you can, please put your questions in the Q&A, because we're going to break after about 40, 50 minutes, and then they will take your questions. And really, this is an interactive kind of conversation, so we want to hear from you. Okay, John, let's start with you. You've been a journalist for a long time. What made you think about diving into this history and examining set-asides for white Americans when most people wouldn't even think that was a thing? Where did you even hear about that?
Well, so and actually, this is explained a little bit in the series Seeing White, but and I talk about how I've been reporting on race off and on for going on 40 years. And I've been interested in it and broadly in social justice issues, including race. But I in about the mid 20-teens, starting, I suppose, with, Trayvon Martin and then Michael Brown and, Dylan Roof massacre and Oscar, and Oscar So White and the rise of Black Lives Matter movement, there was a sense that, and then as Trumpism is arriving on the scene, sort of like this general sense of what is first of all, what is up with white people, right? Like what are we still doing here at this late date with such persistent and pervasive racism in our country? And then specifically sort of like, that there was a sense that there was something that I hadn't understood. There was a level of my analysis of what racism is and how it functions in our society that there was something missing because I just was perplexed. And around that time, through my work, I was actually kind of nudged into doing an anti-racism workshop with an amazing organization called the Racial Equity Institute that's based here in North Carolina, but they travel around and do these typically, 1 day or 2 day workshops. And I sat through this workshop, and there was a lot in it that I knew, but there was a fair bit that I hadn't learned. And there was, in particular, this 1 2-hour talk that Dina Hayes Green, the leader of that group, did, that was specifically about white affirmative action, and it was about sort of upending most people's, certainly most white people's, understanding of who has gotten stuff handed out to them by the government for the last 400 years, right? And that single session of the 2-day workshop was probably the one that was the most kind of impactful for me, that kind of hit me up the head the hardest, and actually was instrumental in making me think, actually I'm gonna think about doing a whole podcast series about whiteness, what it is, how we got it, and sort of, as I say, turning the lens on what I had done as a journalist for a long time, which was to look at race, to report on race by pointing my microphone and my gaze at Black and brown people and saying, how are you doing? What's your experience? And to sort of say, whoa, white people are the story here, and whiteness is the story. But specifically that talk on affirmative action, then I ended up essentially going back and recording that same talk, or this version of the same talk, a year later, and using it in the podcast.
And Chenjerai, one of the things that was striking to me when I heard this segment of the podcast was just, why don't we know much about this? Why is it that affirmative action in our heads is so linked to special privileges for people of color in the minds of most Americans? Why don't we know this, and why does it matter that we do? And we're going to unpack this for you guys, don't worry, but I just wanted him to touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of when you see the wealth of evidence and the wealth of what has occurred over the course of the history of this country, it is sort of amazing that this is not common knowledge and is not a part of the story that we tell ourselves. But it's not. And I think that has to do with a couple of things. I mean, two of the most important factors I would say are that, as somebody who's gotten into history and who thinks, I've learned from people like John, incredible journalists and reporters from like John, and the people that we talk to, historians at the institutions I've worked with, how valuable history is as a way to talk about, something like race relations or those kinds of things. But we don't really, it's not quite as valued, I think, as a part of standard education and public, people don't necessarily think history is relevant. I think the sense is that we have to deal with problems now, and they're very urgent. But, Khalil Gibran Muhammad made an excellent point. He said, in the medical field, there's also a sense that you have to deal with problems now that are urgent. And yet in that field, the history of what has occurred before is extremely relevant to making those decisions. So that's one factor. The second thing, though, I would say is that going all the way back in American history, really to the beginning, what you see is these different arguments that essentially argue that any kind of advancement of Black people is harmful to white people. And this interestingly occurs far before Americans are citizens, and in a way, even before America is actually officially a country, right? There's already these arguments rolling out about the ways in which Black advancement will threaten white folks. So what that shows is, I think, this kind of shifting but continuous political project that is about shaping the sensibility that is now at the center of this conversation, and that the Supreme Court seems positioned to uphold.
Right. Well, let's let people know, because so many people do not know, what this history of government set-asides for white Americans look like. John, as you mentioned in the podcast, the woman who runs that program, you start with her and she's doing her thing, and she asks a really good question. She asks people in the audience, when do you think affirmative action started in the United States? And most people say, oh, like the 1970s. But when it comes to government set-asides for white Americans, we can go way, way, way back. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the colonial period.
Yeah, and she then starts at 1618, right? So 150 years, 160 years before the United States as a country, and you still, just a decade or so after the first Brits, Europeans have arrived in Virginia, and you already have the British government saying, okay, we need more people to go over there and populate this new colony. There aren't enough people going, so let's give 50 acres of land, or in some cases 100 acres of land, to anybody who will go over there and occupy that land and improve it, as they would have said, meaning to farm it or whatever. Land that's being seized from indigenous people in Virginia, right? So already, right, that's a handout of government land to, obviously, by definition, to people who weren't even probably called white. They would have been called Englishmen or Christians, as opposed to the indigenous people or the African people who also were around that time starting to arrive, right, and aboard slave ships on these shores. So 1618, and there are other examples, but just to take another really striking one, 1705, which is by the same year, by the way, that the colonial government is introducing the really brutal slave codes that are seriously circumscribing the rights and opportunities of enslaved Black people in the colonies, and allowing white people to torture and murder, or basically just really encoding, because this is the other thing, is that slavery, as we came to understand it, when we look at the 19th century movies about slavery in the American South, that took quite a while to develop. It wasn't codified, it wasn't legalized, the rules around it weren't in place. That took a century or two to really take that form. So, but 1705, the same year that's a big step in that direction is happening toward what just slashing basically all rights that Black people have. There was a rule in place that if a white indentured servant was released from their servitude, they had to be given 50 acres of land, 30 shillings, a musket, and 10 bushels of corn, I think it was. Right. So basically a handout. You're being freed from a kind of servitude, and here's some stuff and some money to help you get started. So and it's required, right, by the government. So then we moved into,
Can I just jump in on one thing there?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say that, part of what's so fascinating about what John is pointing out is that in this time frame, when you have this sort of handout being given to white indentured servants who are, former indentured servants, as John is pointing out, this is happening simultaneously when you have these laws that are compelling white Americans to surveil and capture and punish Black folks. And, it's funny, I was just talking to the incredible historian Leslie Alexander, who was saying, she was struck looking at those laws by how compulsory they were. Like, this wasn't, white folks were required, and there was real penalties laid out in those slave codes for not, if you saw Black people who might be a fugitive, which is essentially any Black person, that you had to act on that. So in that early phase, these handouts are not just not being given to Blacks, but they're premised on a kind of white solidarity and whiteness that's being formed that's based on Black, remaining in slavery. And sort of, I just think that that's important, because that's not true of every phase, but that is true in that period.
And I think too, right, there's concerns about collaboration, right? And remind me, John, if I'm wrong here, but that becomes an issue too, right? Of separating out, giving these handouts actually allow folks to see a reason to kind of stick to one side, as opposed to joining forces against elites that may not have the interest of the larger populace at heart across the board.
Yeah, there were examples in early colonial history of Black and white people at sort of the bottom of the socioeconomic scale, or in some cases who were in indentured servitude together before slavery was as kind of fully racialized as it would become, right? In the early 1600s, first half of the 1600s, there were more white indentured servants in Virginia than there were black indentured servants, for example. And that changed. And then, later we had really racialized chattel slavery, which was black, right? Black people were enslaved and white people were not. But in that period, it was much more fluid. And you had that, we tell the story in another episode of the podcast of John Punch, who in 1640, he and two European guys, Dutchman and Scotsman, as the story goes, were indentured servitude together, and the three of them decide to escape. And they're caught. The two guys of European descent are sent back and had a couple of extra years of servitude tacked on to their sentences. John Punch is sentenced to perpetual servitude until he's in lifelong slavery, basically. So, and that's actually, historians identify that as the first time, literally, in colonial America, that the same crime was punished differently for a black person and white people, right? So that's, and then there's Bacon's Rebellion, right, 1606, which is a complicated story, but one way of saying what was going on is you had a multiracial kind of uprising of people of poor people. And so this kind of thing was very frightening to the powers that be. And so whether, to whatever extent it was really conscious, or, you can't really find the receipts where a meeting was held of like the white elites in Virginia where they said, right, we have to have a divide and conquer strategy. But that is what they did, right? And you look at those two things that we've talked about that happened in 1705, it couldn't get more stark than that. Black and then people at will, white people were going to give you goodies as you get released from indentured servitude.
Right. And if we fast forward a little bit into the 1700s, there's this Land Ordinance Act that you guys talked about, and Thomas Jefferson helped to draft that.
Yes, and this had to do with basically the pattern of separating the country into tracts and the township system, and what would actually become this, to this day, it lives on in the form of, a tract of a township being set aside for a public school. Well, that system was not meant to serve the indigenous people on this land. It was not meant to serve African people who were arriving on slave ships. That was a school system, free education for people who would come to be called white, right? Or by that time were being called white. So just another example of things that we kind of don't think, you don't think of that as like affirmative action or like a gift from the government to people who happen to have a certain, racial makeup, but that's exactly what it is, right? And then large groups of people are excluded from it.
Right. And Chenjerai, I was thinking maybe you want to bring us to some more recent history, like the New Deal.
Certainly. And I mean, again, John in the show does a great job of bringing together, what Dina Hayes Green narrates. In between we have, the Homestead Act, even, citizenship laws were a kind of set aside because the benefits of citizenship were not available to everyone, but they were important, right, for all kinds of rights that are built upon that. And later you have the Homestead Act, but the New Deal is also really important because that, really, there's so many people living and so many people, who benefited from that, and that's like a real felt sort of life transforming thing that happened in people's family lineages. And it's complicated because there's a lot of, I think there's some, I wouldn't know, I would go so far as to call it misinformation, but certainly misunderstanding about the New Deal. The New Deal, two components of the New Deal that were really important were the housing, Federal Housing Administration loans that made it possible for people to, these tremendous loans that made it possible for people to own property. Although in their first iteration, you kind of had to be a little bit wealthy to take advantage, because I think you had to have something like, 50% of the money down. So that was not initially intended as a racial exclusion per se, but it functioned that way. And then later, along with housing, even if you were applying for a loan, you had things like redlining and all kinds of racial covenants that structured people's access to housing. So the way that the New Deal wound up playing out in this sort of way that made it actually function as this sort of dividing thing. Also, when you look at Social Security, some people have narrated Social Security and said, well, that was intentionally not given to Black folks and those kinds of things. According to my understanding, and I'm not the expert here, but according to my understanding, this functioned this way, and we talk about this in the podcast. It was almost that law imported the racism, structural racism that existed before it, because there were certain kinds of jobs that did not get the Social Security benefits, and Black and Latino workers were disproportionately in those jobs, so they didn't get those benefits, as opposed to it being an intentional way to deprive folks. And then, of course, you have the GI Bill, which gives war veterans of the Korean War, Vietnam War, and World War I, the ability to go to college, right? So again, this is not explicitly denying people based on race, but of course, if you look back in this time, when we're talking again, 1930s, what was the state of education and discrimination? This is before the civil rights movement had gained momentum. So the structure of higher education was already deeply segregated in such a way that it actually required federal intervention to get Black folks into college. So to say it wasn't racial is wrong, right? And then folks benefited for years because of that. So you're talking about housing property, you're talking about Social Security, you're talking about the ability to go to college and the college education and what that means in the job market. And, I just want to pause for a minute, because we're in a moment right now where actually there are politicians who are making it impossible to teach factual history like what we're doing right now. And I think that a lot of those people think that somehow what we're talking about hurts like people like maybe white Americans, for example, right? Who but what we found in the show, and I think John would say the same thing, is people really like to learn this history and to know it, because, many people have emailed us and said, I feel like I was at a disadvantage for most of my life because I never knew this, right? I never had an idea of what this was, and I didn't understand, and it helps them connect the dots. So I think it's really important to be telling this particular version of the story based on these facts.
Is that true, John? I mean, I think particularly for a lot of people, this history is really astonishing, though. Well, I'm curious about that. What was his response? I want to talk about the two people who were kind of going through this, who ended up with very different perspectives. But overall, what would you say people's response was to learning about these things?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, before you say anything, I want to remind people, please put your questions in the Q&A as you're thinking about them, because when we get there, we want to be able to have them jump right in and answer. Okay, go ahead, John.
And before I answer your question, I want to just add one thing, and that is to just really kind of underline as just one, I think it's just an incredibly powerful example is home ownership, right? Yeah. So, and Chandra, I talked about that, right? So actually, to correct Chandra just a little bit, it was actually before the Federal Housing Administration, before the New Deal program, home ownership was limited to very few people, because you had to be able to put 50% down and you had to pay the loan in 5 or 10 years, right? It was very low percentage of Americans who could afford homes. So here comes the Roosevelt plan, that really introduces what we now know as the 30-year mortgage, low interest rates, that vastly expands the number of Americans who can own homes, which is the most powerful way for most kind of working class and middle class people to build wealth, right? Well, 98% of the people who ever benefited from that program are white. And as Tenderized said, partly it was, for one thing, it was administered. Most Black people at that time in the 1930s and 40s lived in the South. Well, who administered the program? Southern, local Southern folks. And they followed the customs of Jim Crow, which is that Black people don't get to do that, right? And then add redlining, that basically all over the country is preventing Black people from even participating, even being able to buy a home. And then to the extent that they can buy a home, their home is worth less money because of racism, right? And I just looked this up as we were just getting ready to go on. In 2022, 75% of white households in this country own their home, 45% of Black households, 48% of Latino households, right? So we still have this huge gap. So back to this thing about like, we don't talk enough about history, my gosh. Depending on the study or what you're counting exactly, they talk about 10 times or 13 times the wealth of the average Black family that the average white family has in this country. This is why. It's not, you have to look at that whole history and then it becomes incredibly easy to understand why that's the case. So to your question of how people have reacted, I've said this, when in 2016, when I started thinking about doing a series on whiteness on the little podcast I was making out of Duke University, we had a few thousand downloads per episode on that podcast. It was fairly new. And I thought, if I do a series on whiteness, are we going to lose half of our little listenership? And to say that the opposite thing happened is, it was the thing that the audience grew, 20-fold and then 50-fold. And that series is still gets kind of more than its share of listens. And I think, and yes, we know that a lot of Black and brown people have listened and we've heard from them, but I think it's certainly fair to say that the good sized majority of the people who've listened are white. I've heard from hundreds of thousands of them, literally. It's got over 6 million downloads. And people share it with their friends and family, and then they start discussion groups in their community about it. And it's just been so obviously there are a whole bunch of white folks who are not ready for this conversation, don't want to have it, don't want to hear it. But there are a whole lot of white folks who are interested and want to learn and want to understand more deeply and more clearly how we got here and who the heck we are, for that matter.
Yeah, and I think it does. Well, let me ask you. I think, well, both you and Chandra are saying this complicates our notion about how success happens here, right, in the United States, how wealth is built here in the United States. And as I mentioned to folks out there who are listening, John had two people who were kind of going through this program, this workshop, while he is recording it, and while he and Tenderized are kind of thinking all of this through, and they came up with very different ideas. As I said, this history should really complicate the ideas that we have about who makes it and why. But one of the participants, Dan, and I'm just going to quote him, listened to all of that. And said, basically, what he came away from is that, the fundamental thing about getting ahead is about having the drive, the will, and the energy to move forward. You can't just lay back and say, bestow it on me. And I remember still listening, and I re-listened again, and I was like, except it's been bestowed on you. What do you mean? So I'm just curious, and I think about this sometimes. Well, I think about it a lot as a journalist who writes about history. I believe, obviously, history, as Chandra is pointing out, is a battleground right now, right? It's a battleground right now. And for me, it feels urgent, like, people need to know. But are people ready to know? Are people willing to know? I don't know. What do you think, Chandra?
Well, yeah, that was fascinating to see those folks try to process what they learned at REI in real time. But I would argue that that discomfort and that sort of dissonance is a part of learning. I go through it all the time, where I read new information. That's one of the things that happens if you read and study is you realize the things you thought aren't true. And you have to have a moment of grappling. And often that doesn't happen like just in the hour after you learn the thing. You don't, you have,
Right.
so while it's disconcerting to hear a person who's just faced all this evidence seem to kind of just reject it to want to return, I suspect that that's a temporary state. And I think it's also why I think history is so important, because what it makes you do, unlike, you can always reject someone's opinion, but when you have historical facts, and you don't like what those facts are adding up to, you have one or two choices. You can either somehow try to prove that those facts aren't real, and if you can't do that, then you have to figure out what they mean, and I like that project of figuring out what they mean. That's, one thing I will say is that this history of white affirmative action and trying to tease out what it means, I think some of the fear is that people feel like, wow, I worked hard for what I have, or my parents worked really hard, and I'm just going to go ahead and say that in general, I think that's true. I think it's hard to be in the world in general and not work. We have a, kind of, we have, that's another conversation about capitalism we can have later, but, everybody is, I feel like life is challenging. And so I don't think that the purpose of this is to sort of invalidate people's work. But I do think that, there's also such a thing as like standing on top of somebody's shoulders and thinking that you're flying, you know what I'm saying? And like, I think that that's what kind of has to be corrected. So my sense is, I mean, look, the vast majority of the people who have downloaded, my work and the work, including the work on Scene on Radio, are white Americans. And I get, people in the military, not just kind of like East Coast bubble people or whatever people get called, but people in the military. And I've had people who actually say it strengthens their sense of American pride. I think, the cat's out the bag. I'm not a very patriotic person. However, some people have said that learning what folks have overcome, learning how groups came together in American history to try to, fight for some of these things, that actually increases their sense of pride. So I think, I know this might be controversial, but I'm starting to whether Republicans believe in white people or not. You know what I mean?
Oh, that sounds like another interesting conversation to have.
They seem to think that white people can't handle true history, but my experience as a media maker is different than that.
I want to ask you guys, we're journalists here. We deal most of the time with what's happening around us right now. Does knowing this history matter right now? At a time when the Supreme Court is poised to end affirmative action as we know it in American universities, and we know that the spillovers will affect a lot more than universities. Why is this history helpful or important to know as we look at ahead to what's coming? John, you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think you can probably guess that I'm going to say that, yes, it matters.
I think you're right. I'm guessing you're going to say it matters. Yes.
And yeah, I mean, for some of the reasons that I've already stated, but I think in this case in particular, I think there's a sense that is expressed by probably some of the justices of the Supreme Court and by many, many white Americans, and certainly more conservative white Americans, that that kind of the default in the United States is that we're sort of we have more or less equal opportunity, right? And people would acknowledge, yes, some people are more or less privileged than others, and that's a fact of life, but that our preferred understanding is that we're all kind of out here making our way, and everybody makes their way and has a chance to do that, and that anything that acknowledges that, even just acknowledges race as a factor in, for example, whether someone would get into college or not, is offensive. to that sensibility for lots of people. And that, yes, we used to have anti-Black racism and racism against Black and brown people. That's mostly kind of been dealt with. And so now we're trying to just be all kind of here together and on the same playing field. So let's not do this stuff anymore, right? And I kind of get that impulse. But I think when you understand, when you kind of take in the magnitude of this history and the sheer quantity, of frankly, the handouts that white folks have gotten, not all in equal measure by any means. It's true, right? And I think that I can imagine there are people saying, gee, my family never got any of this stuff. And that might be true, although your family also was not held in bondage for hundreds of years, right? And you have to overcome that, after just being put out on the road one day in 1865 and, told good luck, you probably had, right? I mean, when you understand just how pervasive the barriers have been for Black people, especially, but for Indigenous people, for brown people, and how much actually has been handed out to white people, large numbers of us, to talk now about, well, we got a problem with maybe giving just a little bit of a nudge to someone applying for the university who's Black or brown. I got a problem with that. It seems to me, I don't know, it just seems to me, I don't even know what word to say. It seems to me not generous, not kind, not cool, churlish. I don't know. There are other words I could come up with.
I
But
want to
I
ask,
think it's absolutely relevant.
we and please put your questions in the chat. We are going to be rounding this out. We are at NYU. We are journalists, and we've got journalism students here. I'm wondering if you guys can talk about two things. One is that you both are award-winning audio journalists, and podcasting is like, one of the most thrilling things that's happening right now. NYU, as many of you may know, is going to be launching a new graduate program in audio reportage. And I'm just curious for people who might be here thinking about doing this kind of work, if you could give a little bit of advice, something short from each of you. And then if you could each talk about reporting a bit on race, and because a lot of students are interested in doing that, but also have some trepidation I've encountered, about doing that.
Yeah, I mean, John, I respect John's tremendous, and yours actually, Rachel, tremendous legacy and experience as journalists. But I would say I'm excited to be able to at NYU contribute. This is going to be to this master's concentration in podcasting. As somebody who's been making podcasts for since probably about like 2013, a lot of people who are doing it in the academy aren't doing it with the full sort of resources of the university available. And with this master's concentration, we're going to make it so that you can come and actually get your degree pretty much in podcasting, while also having exposure to all the other robust aspects of journalism that this program has. And I think that that's crucial right now, because, for example, if you really want to understand what's going on with the Supreme Court right now with these decisions, that requires deep kinds of investigative journalism, and deep storytelling and research. And if you look at our media sphere, we have a lot of like really fast media. I'm not trying to throw shade on any other kinds of media, like somebody's TikTok account, but I'm just saying that some things you need some space and time to say. And as newspapers have struggled to function and have had to change their business models, it becomes hard to do that kind of storytelling. But that's the kind of storytelling that podcasting really specializes in, at least the kind of narrative nonfiction work that both John and I do, and that we'll be supporting here at this thing. So we're really excited. And you should reach out. It's being led by Ellen Horn, who comes with a wealth of experience, both as a person who understands the business of this. but yeah, I mean, like, I mean, and, interestingly, if you really do want to understand, for example, the power of the Supreme Court, how the Supreme Court got to this point, even some of the politics of it, you should listen to a podcast like More Perfect and many other podcasts out there that really tell the story in very engaging ways. And you can see that there's a history here. So let me stop there just to stop and share, but I can say some more about talking about race later.
Hey, John, advice for people wanting to break into this world that you're in?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say do it if you can. I mean, I really, I was a reluctant podcaster. I worked in the public radio system for a long time. And I was kind of blessed to, from a fairly early age, I worked at Minnesota Public Radio for a long time. I worked at something called American Radio Works, which is a documentary production house from American Public Media. I worked at NPR for a while. And I was blessed to, to sort of fall into positions where I could do what was considered long form, 30-minute, 1 hour. And I did a lot of 1 hour radio specials, and I thought of that as long form. But one thing I didn't see with podcasting initially, and that you have to credit actually Serial specific, which is famous for having kind of created this podcast stampede when that came out in 2014. But in general, but specifically that thing of expanding the canvas by saying, okay, we're going to do a 14-part series of 45-minute episodes or whatever. It's like, oh my gosh. So for me, then Seeing White was the first thing like that I did. And it's a total of about 8 hours. And we've done several seasons since then, including the other one that Chenjerai and I did together, the one you mentioned on democracy, that was more like 12 hours altogether, 12 episodes. And that's just, I mean, that's fun, first of all. And just to be able to have, not only within a given episode, to be like, okay, so what happens with these things too, it happened with Seeing White, is I thought, okay, I had an outline, one episode that's going to explain how we got whiteness and race. Well, that turned out to be about 5 episodes, because once you actually start laying it out, what you've learned, you've got to the first episode of his history part, you haven't even gotten to colonial America yet, kind of thing. So to just be able to be able to say, and you don't have an editor saying, well, you only have 53 minutes here for the whole project. Now you can say, no, I'm going to break it off. Here's going to be another episode, and off I go. So that alone is just such a luxury and such a wonderful, wonderful thing. So I'm a very happy podcaster in that regard.
I'm going to say, let's hold off, as Chenjerai did, on the reporting on race question, because we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. And so I want to kind of jump in and see if we can get some questions answered here. Okay, so we've got Alyssa Nicole saying, how can we respond to the inevitable argument that a handout of 50 acres, back whenever it was, is not such a handout, since it required someone to, I'm sorry, I moved around, required someone to lose so much, to leave Europe, take on so much risk. They will argue that this is different from a college admission or a job offer. Any thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, John, yeah, I mean, I have a response, but John, you want to say
Go
something?
ahead, Chenj.
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, if you look at any of the things that were listed, they all required a degree of effort and work on the part of the recipient. What I think is important to understand, though, is that the key thing is that there's some people were not offered those same benefits. So the thing you really want to focus on is the difference between who got it, at least having the opportunity to do it. The term handout is not meant to indicate that the person didn't have to do anything to access those benefits. It indicates that some people were deprived and some people got it. I mean, that's my comment. I don't know what you want to say, John.
You said it better than I would have. Yeah. You had to be a white person coming from England to get that thing. You couldn't come from South America or Africa and get the same gig.
Okay. Let's see. Richard Conniff wants to know, can you explain a bit more about how redlining actually worked?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, there were ratings given, and the federal government required this. Like this came from the federal government that told lenders, you must rank neighborhoods by whether loans should be given there. And so literally the reason for the name is that red lines were drawn around neighborhoods in cities that were predominantly populated by Black people. And basically the direction was, we don't give loans. We don't give loans to people buying homes there. And we will give loans to people in other areas where most of the people are white. I mean, this is very simplified, but that's essentially what happened. So that's why in, inner cities, you had Black people renting for generations, while white people were living in the suburbs, gaining equity in their homes and passing that on to their children and that sort of thing. And it's another big reason for the wealth gap today.
And I just want to also add to that, this term redlining has come to expand to include, to talk about those specific government mandated mechanisms that sort of structured how loans were given out. But there are also other ways that has happened. Wells Fargo, for example, was found to be, charging different kinds of interest rates to African Americans, particular kinds of neighborhoods.
Happening now, right? This is happening.
That's ongoing, right? And so
yeah.
The financial institutions, and so that's, people have also described that as redlining. It's a different mechanism of incentive that's causing them to do that, which they basically figure out a rationale as to why they can charge, more interest to a particular group of people. But yeah, I think it's also important to understand the ways that those things continue.
Here's a question. Someone is wondering, are welfare and affirmative action interchangeable? And I think there are certainly some people who might see it that way. What do you guys have to say to that question?
Go ahead, Chenj.
No is my answer.
Right. The answer is no.
especially since the affirmative action is about sort of activating. It's interesting that the Supreme Court and some of these people who are claimed to be originalists seem to try to argue that the Constitution does not allow for racial consideration. I would encourage everybody to read up on this. One person to read is Ellie Mistel, but apparently those folks have not read the 14th Amendment very closely, which was specifically created in a context specifically to address previous racial issues, if you know anything about the 14th Amendment. So affirmative action has a racial repair component specifically to it. Welfare is a bit different. And interestingly, I haven't seen the latest numbers, but for much of this country's history, the groups that benefited most from welfare was white women. So I think in that way, it's important to distinguish these different kinds of mechanisms. But they certainly, in the context of a political campaign, might all be lumped together as handouts to scare people. And so there's a way in which people might not want you to actually look into the details of how these things work, so that they can scare you about a socialist takeover. Which I'm in favor of, by the way, of socialist.
We have someone asking about Florida. How can we push back against DeSantis' decree to expunge history from public school curricula? I understand that, the AP history program, the Black History program, has been changed to accommodate the situation down there. She refers to him specifically as a madman. So, but just how she wants to know how can people push back against that?
Well, the people of Florida could vote DeSantis out would be one way. Yeah, I mean, I think that's primarily probably for the people of Florida. I don't know, there might be some legal remedies that people can try. I just think it's really interesting that that so much of even the mainstream media and what people have called kind of the reactionary centrists, who are very upset about cancel culture and about what goes on university campuses with the alleged policing of ideology and that kind of thing. A lot of those people aren't talking as loud about actual book bans and the likes of what's going on in Florida with the university down there, that they're trying to basically take over and put conservative people and their ideology in charge. And now this AP African American history thing. I mean, yeah, it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing I will say that one thing I'd like to see more of, when I've seen some of these battles, a lot of the people I see on the front lines of the battles, and I know that there's all kinds of people fighting it, are like Kimberly Crenshaw, because of the term critical race theory is out there. She's almost interviewed for every single thing, and various kinds of scholars on race. But the counts that the stories I would like to hear more of are stories of people and really white people who are saying, who have learned some of this stuff and feel like it helped them. Because I get the emails all the time, but I don't feel like that story is out there. People saying, man, this really helped me. I'm glad to have learned some of this stuff, some of these facts, and I was able to handle learning these facts. It didn't, it didn't destroy me. And I think that narrative needs to be more public out there about how it changed people to give accounts. We don't talk enough about people changing minds and how learning has affected us. And I think we need more of that as part of that battle.
Yeah. And that's part of the journalists, I think, have great power in that, right? In terms of informing and helping people to understand. We've got a question about affirmative action, and it's a good one, about, we've been talking a lot here about white Americans and Black and Brown Americans here. But what we haven't talked about in the context of the current affirmative action case before the Supreme Court is Asian Americans. And the question is, it says it seems like the conversation around affirmative action gets more complicated when you're looking at how affirmative action, relates to other non-white groups. For example, there's been discussion about how Asian Americans fit into the affirmative action conversation, since they are overrepresented in higher education. And obviously that's been an argument that's been used and pointed out, right, as a reason to be concerned about affirmative action because of the way that people point out that it may affect Asian Americans. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take up too much space here, but this is why I think you really got to look into the details of this, because these particular cases that are about to come to the Supreme Court are really super weak ground. I don't know if there's a strong ground to challenge affirmative action, but these are the weakest grounds ever, right? I mean, and the specific Asian American group is Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that they claim are being harmed in these by these policies. And so if you look at the North Carolina case, I mean, I think at that university, there's still essentially more of Asian American and Pacific Islanders admitted than African Americans. So to claim that the affirmative action policy is hurting that group doesn't even make sense in terms of the numbers. But I think, and when you go to the Harvard case, one of the things, if you look at how Harvard sort of decides who gets in, one of the factors that has become controversial is they have these personality ratings. And those personality ratings, there's a pattern of Asian Americans being rated lower on them, because that's just essentially what some committee member thinks about your personality, that they find you interesting. So that metric, which has nothing to do with affirmative action, is actually the thing that hurts people at Harvard. So what's happening is that there's a narrative. I mean, we have to understand too, this Supreme Court case is not based on any genuine interest in who's being discriminated against. This is a campaign being led by Ed Blum and the Students for Fair Admission. It's a conservative campaign that they've tried multiple times. They tried with the Fisher case before this, and it didn't work. And then now here they are back again. And they're creating a narrative that this matters, that this somehow is about affirmative action, and that they're standing on behalf of Asian American Pacific Islanders. But what should also be noted is that, according to the studies I've seen, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders overwhelmingly support affirmative action. Upwards of 60% of them support it. So we need to just dig into this and not allow those fictions to dominate this conversation.
All right. We've got a question from someone saying, how to deal with the responses you might get when you bring up this history and you're talking about racism in America, and someone just flings out well, it's been 200 years, and how long is enough? And how do you respond to people saying, oh, come on, so long ago, what does this have to do with me?
Yeah. Well, and yeah, a lot of people say those things. And what do you say? Well, I go back to, what I've said in a couple of different ways in this conversation, which is that if you really actually look at the history, you'd see that, first of all, is not past, as Faulkner said. But also, if you look at the weight of hundreds of years of history, and to sort of say, well, and for one thing, and Chenjerai and I talked about this in our democracy series, that you can't even talk about the United States having been, kind of gotten somewhat serious about being a multiracial democracy until 1965. Okay. And then we still, now here we are 60 years later, fighting over voting rights and how difficult or easy states are going to make it for Black and other lower income folks, and to marginalized people to get to the polling place. So, and as I live in North Carolina, where the Supreme Court said that their law targeting Black voters was surgically targeted at Black voters to make it harder for them to get to the polls, right? So we're still, all of these ways and all of the studies that show that when it comes to who gets called back for a job interview based on whether their name is Jamal or Brad, right? It's people with the exact same qualifications. Housing discrimination, it's all very much still with us. So the idea that somehow, well, come on, let's just stop paying attention to race. It'd be nice if we were in a place to do that, but I'm afraid.
Yeah, I wish folks would stop paying attention to race. You know what I mean? But like, we not the ones.
Right.
Doing that, you know what I mean? Like
sometimes you're just like, I'm not even thinking about it today, but you're thinking about it. It's clear you're thinking about it. Yeah.
I mean, also, I just want to say too, this is one of, I think we have not even scratched the surface of understanding the ways that slavery and the legacy of slavery has shaped this country and shaped modern day institutions. And we need much more research on that. That said, I think it's also important. Sometimes people do this thing where they just try to put all the injustices in slavery and link everything to slavery. And it's like, yes, a lot of more than you think is based on slavery. Let's be crystal clear. However, there in each era, right? Post Reconstruction and then Jim Crow and every single era after that, there are new mechanisms of racial oppression, also of gender oppression, around sexuality, etc., disability. So this is not like things that happened in one era and now we just still bringing up old stuff. These are things that happen newly in every area and that we're still fighting right now. And that's really important to be clear on. I mean, John just said that, but.
And we're going to wrap up. And so I want to circle back to that question I had asked you guys before, which is, doing this kind of work is not easy. And, I've had students, some white students saying, can I even do this? Like, can I do it? How do I do it? Students of color feeling like they might be pigeonholed, right? Or not taken seriously if they decide they want to work, focus on work regarding their communities. So, John, can you talk about that? Doing this kind of work as a white journalist?
Yeah, I have to say that in some ways, it feels like an even more kind of what's a better use of my of my role, my place as a journalist, to have done this thing where I sort of again turned the lens, right? And as opposed to, I used to have some of that sort of ambiguous feelings are about like, okay, I'm the white journalist and I'm going to report on issues having to do with race. And so I'm going to go into the African-American community in my city or whatever. I'm going to get on a plane and I'm going to go to the south side of Chicago and I'm going to report on what it's like to be a Black person in this community, you know, or to have been to many Indian reservations and that all sometimes did feel a little like, you know, maybe I'm not the best person to be doing this. It feels a little bit like, you know, it smacks of the, there's a whole history in documentary as well as in journalism of like middle-class white people documenting Black and brown people and poor people and feeling good about themselves because they're doing that. And, you know, it's problematic. It's problematic. And actually, so from that standpoint, turning the lens and reporting on white folks and whiteness, that felt more like, okay, now I'm really doing the Lord's work here. Like, you know, but then on the flip side of that is that then I need like somebody like Tenderized to look over my shoulder because I'm suspect as a white person trying to see whiteness too, because we're trained not to. White people are trained not to see it clearly, not to see racism clearly. So it's complicated. It absolutely is. But I would encourage journalists of every shade to report on race, but then also, you know, what we've tried to do too, as with the subsequent series with On Scene on Radio, we followed the Seeing White series with a series on patriarchy called Men, but very much tried to, you know, like build on, not just do it separately, but to say like, okay, how then do race and gender discrimination and sexism interact with each other? And then like, how do those things fit together? And if you're going to look at democracy and how we haven't, you know, the flaws in our democracy and so on. But to the, you know, the overused term intersectionality, but to look at how these things intersect with other kinds of issues as well. There's just a lot of great work to be done.
Tenderized?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess there's three pieces of advice I would have for people, you know, especially if you're, you know, not a person of color. I mean, everybody has some kind of ethnicity, so it's just, but you know, if you're a white person who's interested in this, but having those reservations, firstly, I understand, you know, it's kind of, it is, I mean, let's just acknowledge it's a complicated terrain, right? It's like, if you don't talk about it, then people are like, oh, you're not doing your part. And then when you do, there's all these like sort of landmines that you could fall into. So I get that. Here's my three pieces of advice. First, and actually John is a great example of all of them. First, understand the conversations that have gone before you. You know, don't be a person who shows up with a journalism. Oh my God, I just learned about redlining and I'm going to tell everyone. It's like, that's not a good way to do journalism. See what's been done before. And often your contribution will be kind of a little bit smaller, but important. Like, people have talked about redlining, but they haven't talked about how this plays out in this particular context. You know, I see, for example, people talking about, someone's bringing into the chat conversations about race neutral policies in France and how France has, you know, we know France is really big on French nationalism. Everybody has to be French. They don't want you to talk about your specific ethnicity in that country. That's frowned upon. What has that meant for housing policy in France? You know, is there a conversation about redlining in France to be had? You know, like that might be, you know, a thing to look at. The second thing I would say is, you know, to think about what you have to say from your own sociological address. You know, one reason why I think everybody has something to say is like, you know, no one knows what things look like, you know, from your literally like how you grew up, where you came from, what these things are about. And that's part of what John has brought to this too, is he's brought in his own story and said, look, I come from this particular part. I'm in Minnesota. Here's what's sort of underneath, you know, what I've studied in Minnesota. And the third thing I would say is that when you are going into communities, like the Black community or communities of color, people aren't always going to be thrilled to see you as a journalist, because you come in front of a history that has been a long history of journalism. There's a great project that everyone should look at called Media Reparations 2070. This is a sort of a task force that has come together from Free Press to talk about the history of media, the ways media in particular has been implicated in you know, kinds of oppression, you know, African-American racial oppression in America. And also the history, though, of how folks have tried to fight back, create their own institutions. Everybody should read their incredible essay. But when you know that, then it gives you a little bit more endurance. I mean, even myself, right? Like, you know, I mean, I'm a Black person, but when I go into certain communities, it's not because I'm Black, they recognize me as as family. They're like, oh, you're an outsider, a journalist coming in to maybe harm us. So you have to have some patience and endurance and not take that personally to do that, and be willing to build some rapport. So that's my advice about it.
And what about for journalists of color, Chenjerai, students of color, Chenjerai, who are thinking about doing this work, but worry sometimes, like in white media, that, you know, their stories might not be taken as seriously, or they might not be taken as seriously if they decide to focus on this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real struggle. I think a lot of what we have to address there is structural. So first of all, you know, it's good to become a part of organizations like the National Association for Black Journalists and look at what kinds of collectives you can move into, and mentorship that you can get. That's one thing. But I would say in terms of what's on you, so I don't want to put it all on you. Like this is a structural problem that's going to require structural solutions. But I will say this, I got advice early on, like, you know, one reason why I like history is because it's a place where you can do quality work that even people who disagree with you will still have to find value on it. You know, I mean, if you look at, regardless of whether you might agree with John's take or my take on the stuff on Seen on Radio, and you know, it's like there's a whole bunch of facts and information that is really valuable. And I'm currently working on a podcast about the history of the NYPD. And what I can tell you is not everybody's going to like it, but everybody who listens is going to learn something, you know. And I think that if you focus on creating value, doing stuff that is just, you know, rigorous research, and you hold yourself to that standard, then you can just know you can always be proud of what you're doing. And I think that's an important part of it. But I don't want to act like just doing good work is the only solution, because, you know, the truth is that people of color, women, folks with disabilities, queer folks been doing good work, and it hasn't been recognized. So sometimes when people do win those awards, you know, I got to quote Chris Rock where he said, that is not Black progress, that's white progress. Finally recognized it.
Right. All right. Well, I want to thank you, John Bwin, Chenjerai Kumanyika, and all of you who joined us today. I'm just so grateful to have this kind of conversation and the space to have this kind of conversation. As I mentioned, please keep an eye out for this ongoing series, Hidden Legacy series of conversations that will be coming, and you know, and keep doing the work. It matters. Thank you all.
Thanks for having us, Rachel. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, Rachel. Take care.